Hello, welcome to Q&A. I'm Fran Kelly, and joining us in Melbourne tonight, business and communications consultant Parnell McGuinness, Tasmanian Liberal Senator Eric Abetz, Australia's favourite social justice activist Tim Costello, Masterchef winner and author Adam Liaw, and Victorian Labor Senator Kimberley Kitching. Please welcome our panel. Q&A is coming to you live across Eastern Australia on ABC TV and across the nation on iView and News Radio. We've got plenty to talk about, so let's get to our first question. This is from Oliver Little.
Thanks, Fran. Good evening, panel. This weekend, we saw the member for New England, Barnaby Joyce, make it abundantly clear that an increase to Newstart is in order. How does this Liberal national government expect people to live, or let alone find a job, on $245 a week, when Barnaby can't make ends meet on $4,000 a week? Thanks.
Fair point. Adam Liaw, you want to have a go?
Right off the bat, I think Barnaby's starting to challenge his own reputation as Australia's best retail politician by saying he can't get by on $4,000 a week. But even though people might want to give Barnaby a good kicking, and people on Twitter certainly were doing that today, I think it's a good thing that he's come out and said this. You know, it's great that he's supporting an increase in Newstart. There hasn't been a substantive increase since, I think, 1994. You know, that's a long time ago. It's a quarter of a century ago. And if Barnaby Joyce is having difficulties supporting two families on $200,000 plus a year, divide that in half for $100,000 a year, and people are struggling to support one family. And if you're not even working, and if you're on $40, $38 a day, it's even more difficult still.
Parnell?
Look, if it's hampering people from getting jobs, then I think an allowance designed to get people back into work needs to be increased. And it looks at the moment like that's exactly what it's doing. At this rate, people can't polish up enough to get themselves out the door looking good enough to get a job. On the other hand, I think it has to be addressed as part of a package that goes along with looking at other economic factors. So, for instance, are we training people to take the jobs that are available in the economy? Are we producing too many people who are competing for the same kinds of jobs? So most people who are looking for a job or want more hours are competing for things at quite a low skill level. And that's because we're producing people who don't have specific skills, who don't have differentiated skills. And a lot of the time, people coming out of university with undifferentiated skills are competing with the low-skilled people in our economy.
Tim Costello, what do you think? There's always going to be people unemployed?
Yeah, so full employment really requires about 5% unemployment at any time. So I commend Barnaby for saying that. He's reminding us that divorce is expensive and having a lot of kids is expensive too. But that aside, I commend what he said. Look, when business and charities and the Governor of the Reserve Bank, everyone says this is wrong. When The Economist magazine talks about Australia as the wonder down under, 28 years without recession, the only country really in the world, to have people struggling like this. When Dick Smith, who put up his hand and said, I got 500,000 from the taxpayers, franking credits, we give 500,000 to one of our richest Australians, and I commend him for putting up his hand, and we say to people on Newstart, you've got to live on $40 a day. I personally think it's immoral.
Eric Abetz, what did you think of what your colleague Barnaby Joyce said, and do you think the arguments are stacking up against the government's position?
There's no doubt that Newstart is exceptionally difficult to live on. There is no doubt about that. In fairness, it is indexed twice a year, but of course from a very low base. But it has been increased in line with inflation over the years that it has been operating. Would every politician love to increase Newstart? I think so, but both Liberal and Labor went to the last election without promising to increase Newstart, and there's a reason for that. You have to try to balance the budget, and when you consider that we are still paying about $1 billion a month just in interest, you see the problems that the legacy that is left as a result of deficit budgeting, that you then have to start using your recurrent expenditure to pay interest and ultimately pay off debt. And if we didn't have that burden of debt, didn't have to pay that interest, chances are there'd be money around to in fact provide an increase for Newstart.
Kimberley, Kitching.
Thank you, Oliver. I think that, firstly, I'm not going to denigrate Barnaby Joyce for arriving at a position of empathy, no matter the path he trod to get there. But I do think that, contrary to what Eric's just said, the ALP did go to the election saying there should be a review, and we weren't going to review it to have it go down. So
Just on that, the Prime Minister today described that as, I will not engage in the unfunded empathy of the Labor Party.
Yeah, and he also said that about some of his own coalition members. So I think the Prime Minister's also being quite unempathetic about this issue. I think that if I was a National Party member, traditionally they obviously represent regional seats. Regional unemployment in Australia is much, much higher than it is in the cities. So there's another problem for the National Party there as well. But we can see the government is quite divided on this issue, and more of their members are coming out to say that there should be an increase. I think it will actually, in the end, there will have to be an increase, and not just at, twice a year on the very minimalist sort of CPI level. I think there will have to be an increase for the reasons that Parnell points out, that you have to get public transport to get to a job. You have to dress appropriately. These are all considerations to get people back into work.
Okay, in a related question, the next question comes from Duncan Storer.
Hi, and thanks. Since the election, our Prime Minister has made a big issue about suicide and mental health. Would raising Newstart and reducing punitive social security obligations be the fastest way to make a dent in the rate of suicide and domestic violence amongst the country's 3 million poor people?
Eric Abetz, that's putting it not in an economic framework, but in a social framework, a human framework.
I'm not sure what the statistics are in relation to the scourge that is besetting our society in relation to suicide, but trying to link the two together, I'm not sure necessarily is borne out by the social data, because regrettably people that have a lot of wealth commit suicide. Our returned servicemen and women, that's a real problem. Blokes with marital breakdowns often as well. So there's the scourge of suicide, I think, cannot be just addressed in relation to the issue of a welfare payment with respect.
Not
Both
only,
serious
but isn't
issues.
it fair to say that poverty is a stress in life? There was a report recently about Indigenous Australians and taking suicide, and on poverty, being trapped in poverty was a contributor given there.
Poverty clearly is a stress in life, but there are many poor communities around the world that don't suffer the scourge of suicide that we suffer in Australia and in the Western world. So I suspect there are other factors at play other than just the issue of poverty. And when I say just the issue of poverty, I don't mean to demean it in any way.
Parnell?
From my observation, living in areas which were quite poor years ago, it was the poverty caused stress, but it was actually the hopelessness that led to other factors. It was hopelessness that led to people feeling like they didn't want to live anymore, and led to the kind of frustrations that led to domestic violence. And that hopelessness came from not being able to get a job, not knowing how to go about getting a job. So not that it was even the step before sort of applying for the job. I had people coming to me and saying, can you help me with my CV? I don't know how to do this. Nobody in my family has ever had a job. And so that really deep hopelessness and helplessness has much more to do, I would suggest, with mental illness and with rates of suicide in poor areas than the rate of the allowance which supports people in that time.
Tim Costello, though, is there a relationship between hopelessness and Newstart to some degree? If you're feeling trapped in poverty, and would a lift in Newstart do anything to relieve that?
Yeah, I have no doubt it would. I think the fundamental question all humans ask is, do I matter? And hopelessness comes when you think you don't count, and I think people in Newstart being condemned to live on such an impossibly low, below the poverty line, know they're expendable. They're dispensable, that they don't matter. And I agree with Eric that there's lots of reasons for suicide. When Australia has youth suicide at epidemic levels, clearly the lack of meaning, the pointlessness of life, the nihilism of life contributes. But there's no doubt in my mind that in a society that measures your worth by the school you go to, the car you drive, the brand clothes you wear, we're always, as social beings, scanning the horizon. To be poor actually says you don't matter. To be poor certainly, I think, says that hopelessness and therefore mental illness is intensified.
Kimberley, do you see or accept any kind of link between a low level of Newstart and feeling poor and levels of domestic violence and suicide and hopelessness?
Well, I think there is a level of that, and there's a really good book about this by J.D. Vance, which is a memoir. It's called Hillbilly Elegy, and it's really an explication in some ways of why Middle America voted for Donald Trump, and so I really recommend it. But there is a terribly poignant moment in that book where he realises he manages to get away from. He's never lived in a functional household. He realises he's really very rarely done homework where someone's not throwing something across the table at him. And he manages to get out to the US Marine Corps. They look after him. He goes to Ohio State. He gets accepted to Yale Law. And when he goes back, before he goes to Yale, he realises that he's different from everyone else around him. And it takes him some time to analyse this, but he realises it's because he has hope. And that is a terrible indictment on Western society. Terrible.
Adam?
I think it's a fundamental question of dignity. You know, Newstart is there to help people who have quite often lost employment. It's people who are 63% are aged between 35 and 65 years old, and losing a job isn't just losing a source of income, it's also losing a support structure, losing friends, often leaving you quite alone. And if you find yourself in that situation, the worst thing that we can do is say to you that you are not worthy of a wage that allows you to live. You know, we have to allow, Newstart has to be there to get people back on their feet, get them back into employment. And that's not just paying them money, it's also putting them back into a system where they can help their mental health with the people around them.
And just on that point, before we leave this, which we must leave it because we've got so many good issues to go to tonight, but that notion of it being a temporary payment, there's more and more older Australians, people over 55, something like 173,000 of them on Newstart, who can't find work and are waiting basically till they get to pension age. That's a problem, isn't it, Eric Abetz?
Clearly it is a problem, and that is why as a government, one, we focus on job creation and also providing incentives to employers to take on mature age, because trying to get people in employment, that's the best welfare system that a government can deliver, and that is what we seek to focus on, but we've got to make sure that we don't leave behind those that are unfortunate enough not to get a job.
Okay, let's go to our next question, and that comes from Rob Ward.
Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to ask this question. My question goes to my friend Tim Costello. Tim, you've recently been reported as saying that Christians should calm down in the face of what would seem to be an increasing intolerance of the Christian faith. So my question is, should Luke and Carla Barrell, publishers of White, the wedding magazine, forced out of business for failing to promote same-sex marriage, should they calm down? Should Joshua, the uni student, suspended for daring to pray, should he calm down? And what about the Melbourne IT specialist, fired for privately expressing concerns about the Safe Schools program? Should he calm down? What do we do?
So,
Tim, that's especially yours.
thank you. I was speaking to my mob, the Christian mob. I would also say to some on the hard secular left, they should calm down. And I think I paraphrased Jesus, who said, turn the other cheek. My paraphrase was, calm down and suck it up. And by that, I'm saying we've just elected our first Pentecostal Prime Minister who could pray openly for 6 minutes at Hillsong and talk openly about his faith. This notion that we're victimised, we're persecuted. I'll show you real persecution in my World Vision work where Christians really are suffering. But To your question, I do think there are real issues around freedom of religion. I think freedom of religion is actually good for society. Freedom of Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Christians to actually run institutions, have schools, charities that express their vision of flourishing is good in a democratic society. And I do think there are loopholes. I know in New South Wales that you can be sacked because of your religion. An employer can say to a woman wearing a hijab, "You're scaring the customers, you're fired." I think that's not on. I think to go to what's behind your question, that Christians should be working this out sensibly, because I think there's a lot of victim claiming and we're persecuted, which is overreach. I think there are solutions. If I criticise left and right, and I try and say, I try not to go left or right, I try to say go deeper, I think left and right want to keep the war going often, and overreach and hysteria keeps the war going. In the middle's us, the exhausted middle who want to compromise and live together. And I think we can find solutions to this. I do blame social media in part, which actually says, you disagree with me equals you hate me, and I'm going to hate you back. I think overborne statements from my mob, Christians saying we're now persecuted, though there are real issues, don't help in that sense of the culture wars going on, and to find compromise and acceptance.
Tim, the other part of your quote, I think, in that calm down, Jesus didn't go around demanding legislation to protect his rights. Kimberley, do you think we need legislation to protect religious rights, freedoms?
Well, the government is proposing legislation and we're still waiting to see it. I think they're working through their backbench to come up with what I think is going to be a minimalist model. I don't actually know, but I think that's what it seems like. One of the reasons this is so difficult, I think, is, Eric and I were actually both on the Senate Select Committee for Same-Sex Marriage, where we started to look at these issues. We then had a Ruddock review because, in fact, it became very difficult to really, in the time allotted for the inquiry, to come to a point where we could solve these issues. And in fact, you can see now that this inquiry, the Ruddock review, was released rather belatedly last year, but it's taken some time. We're now in July, soon to be August, and we still don't really have anything. We then had a religious freedoms inquiry in one of the Senate standing committees. That also didn't really come to any view, and in fact one of the recommendations was to go to the Law Reform Commission, and that was around students and teachers, so Section 37 of the Sex Discrimination Act particularly. But I do think that from the evidence that committee heard, that there are people who really do feel that they cannot express their view. I don't think it is helpful to look at this in some dialectic where you've got, people looking for certain rights, their rights to be protected against other people. We live in a society where, dare I say it, thank God, we do have a contest of rights. And we are very lucky to live in a society where we do have that. So we are not as Asia Bibi in Pakistan.
Okay, we've got a few questions around this issue. So why don't we go to our next question now from Sarah Cogger, and we'll keep this sort of discussion around this issue going.
Good evening, thank you. Another question for you, Tim. Many Christians support Israel Folau, not because of his specific views, but because they believe it's both unlawful and morally wrong for an employer to terminate an employee's contract for their public expression of Christian faith. And yet Jesus commanded us to turn the other cheek, which presumably still applies in the case of unlawful persecution. So if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. How should Christians respond to Israel's case in light of Jesus' command?
Actually, Tim, I'm not going to give that to you. I'm going to give that one to Eric first off. You can come to it in a minute. Eric?
Look, our society has been based on freedom of speech, freedom of belief, freedom of association, of which freedom of religion is a subset. And that is why I think we have one of the best cultures and societies in the world, because that has been one of our foundation stones. That is part and parcel of the ICCPR, Article 18, if I recall correctly, that freedom of religion is deemed in international law to be one of those fundamental rights that the state cannot take away from you unless it is absolutely necessary. And so going to Tim's point, it's okay if you're the Prime Minister, you can pray for 6 minutes at Hillsong, but what happens if you are a rugby player who gets sacked because of certain pressure? What happens especially to the Pacific Islander kids who are of the Christian faith, growing up in Western Sydney, aspiring to become rugby players like Izzy Folau, and they seem sacked? What does that tell them about the Christian faith, their right to freedom of expression, freedom of association and freedom of belief?
Isn't that exactly the same argument that Rugby Australia uses for what about the young kids who are gay who see a footballer who's paid a lot of money and one of their stars of the league saying they're going to burn in hell? You're both concerned for the young people.
In fairness, look, he also said unless they repent, but that is where I believe that we as a society...
Well, I don't think sexuality is something to repent for.
Sorry?
I don't think sexuality is a repenting thing, is it?
Look, I don't want to get into a theological discussion.
Oh, let's have it.
I think
let's
we're
go.
here. I think we're in the middle of one.
Because this is a matter of freedom of speech, and it does come to pass that there will be a conflict of ideas, a clash of ideas, and therefore it is the question of how you go about it, and should somebody lose their employment because they hold this particular view. My approach to this is right, wrong or indifferent. Izzy Folau had the right to say that on his Instagram, and who was part and parcel of his Instagram? It was somebody looking at it and then publicising it further. And so if you can't have that basic communication within our society, then I think we've got a real problem where people are not allowed to give expression to that which they believe.
Tim, just on the theological point, I think, of Sarah's question, which is, should Christians be turning the other cheek, not heading to the courts?
Yeah, I believe that. For the first
in Israel Folau's case?
Yeah. Look, my position's complex. I think Rugby Australia and corporates for that matter shouldn't have some fundamental right about their corporate reputation and their brand over against rights of freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So I support Izzy Folau's freedom to quote, in his case, to misquote the Bible. I also know that LGBTQI advocates are saying we're just trying to keep young gay people alive. This is not about attacking freedom of religion. This is actually about keeping them alive. It's what I mean by calm down. Let's find a centre here. I personally believe that schools that are Christian, Muslim, Jewish should be able to teach that gender is binary without being carted off to a tribunal, even though that's not officially the politically correct position, that free speech and debate actually deals with these issues much better than legislation. I would say I didn't hear you, Eric, when Scott McIntyre, the SBS employee, was dismissed for saying some volatile things about Anzacs. He lost his job too. I think there's often double standards here, that we only pick up one set of rights, which is why I'm calling for a calm debate, because I think legislation isn't a silver bullet. It won't cover all of this situation. We actually need to find that middle ground and respect these rights in balance.
Adam?
We live in a country where everybody is free to practice their religion, provided it's consistent with the secular laws of the land. And we are an expressly non-discriminatory country. There's always going to be an area of tension where religion, which prescribes moral correctness and a set way of living, is going to come into tension with non-discrimination. I completely agree with Tim that this is an area where we need common sense. We don't need to rush to legislation to try and correct everything that we see as being wrong. If you look at the Israel Folau case, think of the absolute absurdity where you have an organisation like Rugby Australia, which is stated on the front of their website that they are about diversity of gender, diversity of sexuality, and they are absolutely powerless to stop one of their prime employees, contractors, whatever his situation may be, from consistently undermining the aims of their organisation just because he happens to not just believe something but believe it really, really strongly.
So it seems to be.
So in the name of inclusion, we're excluding him.
No,
in the name of tolerance, we're saying he can't say that which he wants to say.
He can say it
Then
as
there's
much
a
as he
flip side
likes.
of that, isn't there?
He can say that as much as he likes, but does Rugby Australia have to keep paying him while he's saying that against their wishes?
Isn't Rugby Australia about getting the best possible players on the field, and it's about rugby and it's not about religious beliefs?
That is
I would
absolutely
like
not
to
the
see a Rugby Australia team that can have Christians, atheists, Muslims, just as long as they know how to play the game.
In modern sport,
Okay.
in modern sport, athletes are not just about what they do on the field. Israel Folau should know this better than anyone because he was paid millions of dollars to play AFL, a game that he is not very good
and
at.
what about
hang
all
on,
the
hang on,
blokes
hang on,
that
hang on,
drink too
hang on,
much,
hang on,
but
hang on,
they're kept
Parnell.
on?
I know a bit about brands. Izzy
I've got a
Folau's a brand and
constructive-
so is Rugby Australia.
Absolutely, and I've got a constructive suggestion for this. How about he gets paid for sports balling a certain amount and he gets paid as a brand ambassador a certain amount, and then if he doesn't do what he's told to as a brand ambassador, they stop paying him that amount and he still gets paid for sports balling. You know, quite simple. Let's just divorce what this is about, because frankly it's also down to Rugby Australia in this not being very clear about what that brand ambassador role was. So
Is that the case, not being clear? He'd been warned once and then re-signed after that, didn't he?
his warnings were very unclear in themselves, it seems. So he was just to be respectful. Now, to somebody who believes his faith the way he does, quoting a passage from the Bible or misquoting a passage from the Bible, what's disrespectful about that? What's the problem with that? So I really think that I couldn't agree more with what you're both saying about this is not about legislation. This has to be sorted out by common sense. But there are also things that you can do from a very concrete perspective to just separate the issues that we've got, that we're dealing with here. Brands and actions and jobs can be separated out.
Okay, before we leave this topic or this spiritual domain, our next question comes from Selena Gretsch.
Thanks, Fran. What does the panel think about Scott Morrison's recent appearance at a Hillsong conference promoting his Christian beliefs while acting in his role as the leader of a secular, multicultural, multi-faith country?
Kimberley, guess what? That's yours.
Thanks, Selena. I think, look, if people have a faith, I think that's actually really good, very helpful, probably even more so in Parliament. I think it probably is a source of strength that is sometimes much needed. But I actually don't have a problem if he wants to go and, profess his faith and talk about his faith. That's his private time. I understand what you're saying. He's also the Prime Minister of our country. But I think you'd find that in Parliament there are some very strong believers and he is one of them.
It's what's different, and this perhaps goes to the question, to Selena's question, is in the election campaign, of course, he invited the cameras in to see him pray. That's an unusual thing.
It is unusual, and it's more, I think we see it in other countries around the world more so than we have seen here, which brings in another question, I think, around, I think the influencing perhaps from the United States and from its political campaigning. But if people have deep belief, I don't really have a problem with that.
Can I say that I do think something has changed. Eric may remember this. I remember my brother when he went into politics saying he was advised, don't talk about your religion, it's a secular country, they'll think you're a fanatic. Something has shifted where now, and I think this is good, you can be upfront about your faith. And I like the fact that Scott Morrison said, I'm upfront about my faith, encouraging everyone else to be upfront about their faith.
When you say something has shifted, do you think it's only shifted since this Prime Minister has done it?
No, I think it's been shifting for some time. And I think it's a global zeitgeist there, where religion literally is back as a force. John Kerry said if he had his time over again as Secretary of State, he would study religion to understand geopolitics. So something has profoundly shifted. The thing I'd add is the interesting thing I think that Scott Morrison's going to find out is that Probably for the next 3 years, we're going to be having debates about what Christianity really means. I've got secular journalists ringing me now who are thumbing through the Bible for the first time in their lives. And they're saying...
Which Bible?
My Bible. And I'll just say, Izzy Folau's list, that was from Ephesians. There's another book in the Bible which starts like his list. God says, I'm going to judge sorcerers, perjurers, adulterers, and those who defraud their labourers from proper wages and oppress the foreigner in our midst. Think refugees, and the widow and orphan, think Newstart. There's a whole lot more in the Bible that I'm up for discussing.
Okay. Adam, are you comfortable with this?
Why not? Millions of Australians go to church of all denominations all over. It doesn't mean that our Prime Minister has to go to every single church. It doesn't mean he has to be every single Australian. He can still conduct himself as Prime Minister in a way that is befitting of governing and being a Member of Parliament for all Australians while still having a faith.
Parnell?
I couldn't agree more, and I think look, Julia Gillard was our first openly atheist Prime Minister, right? And that was actually quite important. It's important that we're tolerant to every outlook on life that is not harming others. So it was wonderful to hear her say, I'm an atheist, that's just how I feel about life, because for a long time that was something politicians couldn't say. You had to pretend to have some kind of a faith. And it's wonderful, on the other hand, to hear somebody sincerely profess their faith, not hold it as a political instrument, but simply hold it and say, this is me, but I'm not going to impose it on everybody else.
Eric, is Parnell onto something? It did seem risky. I remember when Julia Gillard declared herself an atheist, and perhaps some think it is risky for this current Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, to be so public with his faith. Is that, in a secular society that we are, we've seen it as risky in the past to have these extremes, is perhaps not the quite right word, but declarative positions?
Our fellow Australians are very tolerant, and they look at people on their performance. And they judged Julia Gillard not on her atheism, but on the government. They judged Scott Morrison not on his Christianity, but on his performance. But one thing I will say to this audience is, it's amazing how many people of the left side of politics have expressed concern about Scott Morrison's profession of faith, yet was strangely silent when Kevin Rudd continually had press conferences outside of church in the lead up to him becoming Prime Minister. His Christian faith seemed to be okay, but Scott Morrison from the Liberal side, that seems to be a problem.
I don't know. I think there's
we
a fair
need
bit
some
of commentary
consistency.
about that too.
I think we need some consistency here.
All right.
But if we are genuinely tolerant, multi-faith, multicultural society, it stands to reason that sometimes we will throw up a Christian Prime Minister, sometimes an atheist Prime Minister, and that's the way it ought to be.
Okay, remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, let us know on Twitter, and keep an eye on the RMIT ABC Fact Check and the Conversation website for the results. Our next question comes from Harrison Simons.
Good evening. This is a question to Adam. Given the recent wage theft scandal involving Masterchef judge and restaurateur George Calombaris, and his resignation from Masterchef, supposedly after a dispute seeking a 40% pay increase, do you feel that there's a hierarchy within the culinary profession which enables owners and chefs to mistreat and underpay staff while they feel free to demand more?
Adam, you're here.
Good morning to you too, Harrison. I think Matt Preston was on radio this morning saying that that 40% increase that was mooted was not accurate, or that they had agreed to commercial terms, or you can check his comments. I didn't listen to them because I wasn't in Melbourne at that time.
What about the broader question? Is there a hierarchy?
Is there a hierarchy? I mean, people should be paid the legal wage to which they're entitled. I don't think you'll find anyone in this country that thinks otherwise on that point. There is a difficulty, however. You know, I'm not a restaurateur. I don't run a restaurant. I have worked in an awful lot of restaurants. I've flipped burgers, I've washed dishes, I've cleaned toilets. And I can tell you that in the vast majority of those jobs, I was not paid an award wage. Generally, the larger the organisation, the organisations that could afford to have payroll people to keep an eye on whether everything was being paid accordingly, were the ones that paid better, and the smaller organisations, the mum and dad restaurants that couldn't keep across the complexities of the award wage system were the ones that were paying below the award wage, $10 an hour, $5 an hour in some cases, in some of my cases, I should say. None of this is an excuse for not paying your employees properly, but I think we have to understand also that, I mean, the question came up this week about whether or not that should be criminal, and to that I would say, why not? You know, it's a form of fraud and dishonesty just like anything else, but let's not get giddy about celebrity chefs being thrown in prison, because I don't think we're quite at that point yet.
But we have seen some spectacular sums around this from some of the big chefs, the celebrity chefs, and their establishments or the businesses backing them. You know, the figure we all know is George Calombaris made establishment $7.8 million, but it's the others too. It's some of the biggest names.
Exactly. There's definitely more to come on this. What we see in the industry is that we've gone from a situation across the food industry where an individual mum and dad restaurant was able to survive. I think with rising costs, that's becoming less and less the case, and so we're seeing far more aggregation of restaurants. And when you're going from a lot of different restaurants being independently operated, often that are not being well run or appropriately run, and they're not paying award wages, going into an area of aggregation where the systems need to be better, the systems need to be more accurate, that's where we're finding these kind of systemic discrepancies coming to the fore.
Okay, before we go to the rest of the panel, let's go to our next question, which is from Charlotte McLeod.
Hi, if I, as an anonymous member of the community, were to steal, misplace or misappropriate $7.8 million, I would expect a prison sentence. How is wage underpayment not theft? Does the panel believe there should be prison sentences for industrial scale underpayment of wages?
Kimberley.
Yes, I do. For the reason that, you know, it is thieving. It is thieving from people who, you know, if it was done the other way, and I think of the person at NAB who stole a whole lot of money, embezzled it, you know, she's been charged. It should happen the other way. And I notice also these systemic errors are never the overpayments. It's never the other way that they make the mistakes. It's always underpayments. And I think every business operates with an informal social licence. So I think if you are, you know, there were reports that Mr. Calombaris' restaurants weren't being very well patronised. I think that is, you know, because people are going to vote with their feet. They don't want to be associated with someone who has done that to his staff. And I think that if you are going to criminalise for large-scale wage underpayment, wage theft, then I think that's a good place. I think it is necessary. But we would need to see enough successful prosecutions in order for the deterrent factor to really sort of start. And in Victoria, of course, the state government here is going to actually start to criminalise and is going to introduce legislation. I don't think it properly belongs in the state system. I think it really is a federal responsibility because you've got a hybrid civil criminal system going on, and I think that would be better in a federal system rather than a state system, but at least the Victorian government is doing something about it.
Eric, I'll come to you, but I think Adam is chomping at the bit.
Yeah, absolutely. The deterrence in terms of increasing penalties and putting people in prison for doing large-scale systemic wage theft is certainly something that definitely should be on the table. You know,
so should some of these chefs be locked up?
I cannot comment on the...
I knew you couldn't.
on that, but
prison food might be better.
As well as the deterrence factor, I think we also need to look, if the goal is truly to resolve systemic underpayment of staff in hospitality, we need to look at other issues where we can help businesses to do this as well. You know, the awards for hospitality are difficult. We can look at simplifying that. We can look at making that more accessible for people who don't have large payroll facilities and large payroll operations. But, you know, the carrot and stick is going to have an effect here, and it's going to be the way we need to go, I think.
Eric Abetz?
Look, wage theft, completely unacceptable. The government in recent times has beefed up the Fair Work Ombudsman's budget by over $10 million to assist in this area. The Attorney-General, who's also Minister for Industrial Relations, is having a review of the IR laws, and that will be part of it. And for my tuppence worth, stealing from employees, and that's what it is, should be treated by the criminal law exactly the same way as employees stealing from employers. And I think it's pretty
So we do
clear.
need a change of law for that. I mean, the Attorney-General said he's looking at this recommendation from the Alan Fells report. This should happen speedily?
Well, look, I would be encouraging my colleagues to go down that track. There will be the difficulty, as in any criminal prosecution, as to whether it was an honest mistake or not. But when it's, I think, so systemic, especially in bigger institutions, then one suspects that it might not have been an honest mistake of a mum and dad restaurant accidentally reading the wrong award or whatever. But when we're dealing with the figures that have been mentioned, then clearly something is terribly wrong. And as a matter of principle, it should be under the criminal law. Theft is theft, whether it's from the employer against the employee or indeed the employee against the employer.
We've got a bit to get through. Parnell, a quick answer from you?
I agree that before we go to a criminalisation of something like this, although that's important as well, that the penalty codes need to be looked at. But as I said before, we also need to look at how many people are competing for each job. If there are a lot of people competing for low-skilled roles, then you will get into a situation where some people declare themselves one way or another to be willing to do that job for less. And in hospitality, that happens quite often, informally, but it happens.
You think it's people putting their hands up for a pay cut?
Well, it's accepting it. It's
accepting it. It's
accepting
been the accepted way, I think, but now it's calling it wage theft. That makes a difference, doesn't it?
It does, and of course criminalising it would make a difference to whether people were being underpaid, but it might also make a difference to whether certain businesses would exist at all. I mean, certainly in small family businesses, this is often, often it's the owner who takes the first wage cut or earns nothing as a result of this sort of thing. And then if the business is still not making ends meet, then it might be some of the staff. I'm not saying that's right. It's very, very wrong, but that is the way of the world.
Or the 7-Eleven where they stood over people to reimburse some of their money. I mean, it is not acceptable to treat people like that.
And if you can't make your business run without stealing wages, then you shouldn't be in the business.
All right, let's move on now. We've got a web question now. It's from...
Thank you.
Round of applause. This is from David Downs in Melbourne. The Ensuring Integrity Bill gives the government power to deregister unions and ban individual union officials. Surely the actions of John Setka have provided the Coalition with the ammunition to crack down on organisations who believe that might is right. Kimberley, Kitchen, that's to you. Have the unions brought this on themselves?
No, they absolutely have not. And we have to remember that the Ensuring Integrity Bill has no retrospectivity to it, so it is not going to deal with John Setka. Unless he, if the government is successful in passing the legislation and he does something, down the track according to that legislation, then maybe yes, but there is no retrospectivity.
Are you arguing
to it.
for retrospectivity?
No, I'm not. And as you and I both know, we live in a precedent-based legal system. There are very few pieces of legislation with retrospectivity.
To hide behind.
But you and I both know as well, Eric, that this bill, the last time the Liberal government had effective control of both houses, they they passed work choices and that was their own funeral. So let's see what happens with the Ensuring Integrity Bill and whether it is total overreach by this government into the rights. We've been talking about rights, including the right of freedom of association. It is not appropriate to have someone who says sufficient interest, whatever that might mean, be able to go into a union and decide who represents those members, which this bill does, whether I'm a disgruntled employer who might not like a union, for example, examining wage theft, could be an example of someone with sufficient interest to then actually have someone prosecuted under this legislation.
And the court of
this
law.
legislation is is appalling.
It is an interesting juxtaposition. The wage theft and the unions, of course, who are fighting that battle front and centre, are at the same time under attack by this legislation.
Look, only 10% of the private sector are actually in the trade union movement, so 90% of workers are not covered by trade unions.
But wage theft campaigns cover more than the unionised members.
Oh, and that is where the Fair Work Ombudsman has just been given an extra $10 million to pursue matters such as this. But look, the vast bulk of union officials are good, honest, decent men and women. They have nothing to fear. But it is those, like John Setka, who have a lot to fear. And quite frankly, if I was in a trade union, I would be very happy with that sort of legislation because it would ensure that the same standard that applies in corporations to directors would apply to union officials. And company directors deal with shareholders' money, union officials deal with union members' money.
Okay, Tim
there is
Costello,
no real moral difference.
If the vast number of union officials are law-abiding, do we need this legislation?
Look, I think there's a solution here. I'd make an appeal to John Setka to resign and step down. Why? Because Jackie Lambie, who's the key vote, has said the unions have a problem. John Setka, she said, I'm against union busting bills and sees it that way. But whether retrospective or not, John Setka has given the government the opportunity for this union busting bill. My plea, John Setka, whatever you think about your innocence and your strength of being a union leader, do the right thing for the sake of the union and step down.
But if he steps down, the government's not going to drop this bill, are you?
No, because...
But Jackie Lambie might then say. Jackie Lambie then says no.
So you're not a fan of the bill, is what you're saying?
No, I think union busting, we need... Look,
well, it's not union busting.
Well, that's what Jackie Lambie's words. In construction, there were 12,000 injuries last year. You do need protection of unions. Those injuries are serious. So.
And what has John Setka done about that?
OK, well, let's forget John Setka for a moment. Let's talk about the legislation, Parnell.
I think you need legislation to control some of the excesses of the unions where they have been bullying workers rather than sticking up for them. Specifically, I've come across some smaller unions which have been springing up to actually represent the members because they've felt that the large umbrella union that represents them has become too politicised and is imposing its will upon them rather than doing their will and sticking up for them. So I think it's really important that system gets some kind of a check and balance. And I actually think that those workers who have started forming those small unions will be extremely glad and extremely grateful to have some sort of check on the big bully unions who have been oppressing them.
Adam? Do you think we need a check on the big bully unions?
I don't think it really comes up for discussion on this. Jackie Lambie, I think, is going to get the Labor Party off the hook on this one by forcing the union's hand. You know, she pushes her position, pushes getting rid of John Setka back onto the unions, which then takes the bill off the table. I don't think the Centre Alliance senators...
Until the next John Setka comes along.
OK, you're watching Q&A live. At the end of August, we'll have our high school special. So if you're a senior high school student and you reckon you've got what it takes to join the Q&A panel, head to our website and upload an audition video. We're looking for the smart young leaders of tomorrow to take on the politicians of today. The next question comes from Belinda Lawson. Belinda.
Hi. Gambling is often treated as a bit of harmless fun, but gambling addiction can cause great misery to individuals and families and may contribute to dangerous levels of household debt, family violence, homelessness and substance abuse. With this in mind, what do you think of the alarming and apparently unfettered proliferation of gambling advertising in recent years?
Tim Costello, there seem to be an awful number of questions with your name on it tonight, and that's one of them.
Yeah, well, with today's revelations, yesterday's about Crown Casino, this is just such an important question. We need a royal commission into gambling. We have 18% of all the world's pokies. We have the greatest losses per capita in the world by 30%. The country that comes second, Singapore, 30% behind us, then it's Ireland. Gambling in Australia has captured and corrupted politics. And we've seen this now with Crown Casino's expose that rich Chinese criminals running junkets can come in, expedited visas. We know that they're laundering money. Nearly 20% of funds going through a casino is laundered money. We know that some $15 billion of money going through casinos is laundered. That means it's actually selling ice and cocaine, addicting our kids and often killing our kids. So what we desperately need to do is have a Royal Commission. I certainly believe that the gambling advertising would be coming up in a Royal Commission. How did the Northern Territory...
Can I just stop you there? What do you want the Royal Commission into? The Crown... I mean...
Crown would be 3 days of it.
OK, but a Royal Commission into what?
Into the hold that gambling has and political donations from gambling industry has on both the major parties, and why ex-politicians always go to gambling jobs. So right at the moment, Crown hasn't come out and made a statement to the ASX, which it should have. The chair, John Alexander, should have. We know that the political operatives, ex-politicians in the gambling industry and at Crown are working the back rooms right at the moment and putting the pressure on the pollies because there is just so much easy money here for state governments from the revenue. When it comes to gambling advertising targeting our kids, the Northern Territory, how did it license so many foreign betting companies that actually spend $300 million a year advertising, and I say deliberately grooming our kids? Kids know the labels, the jingles, they've mainstreamed sport, cricket and football, rugby with gambling ads. This is an adult product that is targeting our kids. So we need a Royal Commission to ask all those questions.
Eric Abetz, Royal Commission, to check what Tim Costello just said. That the gambling industry has captured and corrupted our politicians?
It nearly seems today that if there's a problem, just say Royal Commission and you can set it aside.
Is it a good idea?
Look, I remain to be convinced that we need a Royal Commission into gambling per se in relation to the casino matter that I think still has a lot of play in it, and we'll find out the exact facts. But look, gambling is a scourge. It has destroyed many lives, many families, and that is why I think the community generally needs to treat it a lot more seriously. That said, the vast bulk of us are grown-up adults, and we have a freedom to determine what we do with our money, and so I'm twixt and between. I think gambling's a scourge, but do I want government saying you can gamble on this or you can't gamble on that? You know, these days, pull out your mobile phone and you can lose your house just on your phone. You don't have to go to a casino.
That's the point, isn't it, though? I mean, government will bring in a seatbelt law. Exactly. If you can pick up your phone and lose your house, should there be something done about that?
Oh, well, how can you guard against that? Because it is now international.
So Italy's banned all sports betting, no ads, all gambling ads. In England, the FA Cup has banned the sponsorship with Ladbrokes. You could do that because they've said it's corrupting sport and it's corrupting our kids. There's a lot of things government can do.
I think, Kimberley, do you want to have a say?
Well, there's a self-excluding regime that you can be voluntary in that you can have someone you can have someone nominate someone else.
But that all goes to the individual. What about the notion that gambling has captured and corrupted politicians?
Look, I actually don't agree with that. No. I think that it just doesn't happen where we don't have, gaming lobbyists in our offices. I mean, I wouldn't have had one. So
bipartisan agreement on that. What do you think?
It's just not.
I'm just disappointed in that every day on the television, our children have the opportunity to see betting ads, and they don't just talk about the sport; they talk about the odds, and I think that's a really big problem for our country.
And I think exposure to kids is a real issue.
I absolutely agree. Every day they say the odds in TV. Isn't it time that we had a Royal Commission into teaching of stats in schools? I'd love it if people actually understood what those odds are and what probability is, because if we did understand that a little bit better, perhaps we would be better protected against that sort of advertising.
Okay, Adam?
the gambling industry is a business model based on addiction, and they don't even have to produce a cigarette or get you to drink some booze or even put on a sporting match to do that. The addiction is the money itself, and we need to take more efforts to do that. We've taken alcohol advertising out, cigarette advertising out, gambling is the next step, and I don't think the situation that we have at the moment is going to persist for very long.
Do you think we need a Royal Commission?
I mean, I think if we can get some action without having to do a Royal Commission, without having to go to that as a last resort, it would be much more preferable. I think we understand the problem that we are facing, and we understand the size of the problem. Corruption aside, you know, gambling and addiction to gambling is an enormous problem.
Okay. Well, we've just got time for one last question, and it comes from Adele Roda.
Hi, panel. A question specifically for Adam. After MasterChef's trio of judges left the show due to Network 10 declining their demands of a pay rise, on top of their $1 million salaries, it appears that the panel chose their financial status over the true purpose of the show, to encourage a passion for cooking. Who then do you believe should be the next panel of judges on MasterChef? And what values will they encompass to reinforce the true meaning of the show?
Now, I'm not going to come to you yet. I'm going to come to you. Keep that in mind. Let's start with Kimberley on that one. Who should be the next panel of judges, and what values should they encompass to reinforce the true meaning of the show?
Well, I think one of the beautiful things about cooking is you know, you can share it with people. There's love and generosity in that. So I would like to see, you know, some of those attributes in a show on cooking. You know, I have a really very dear friend of mine who is very Anglo. Her heritage is British and Scottish. She makes world's best tzatziki, but there is something very lovely about that sharing of food and you know what it means when she gives you that. I think it's a lovely thing, and so I think.
Okay, so that's the values. I think people are looking for names tonight.
Names, names. I can't remember the one who does the Great British Bake Off.
Oh, okay.
I think she's excellent.
All right, Parnell.
Goodness, I'm trying to think of the names of some chefs and some restaurateurs who I really admire, but it's dangerous to talk in those terms these days, aren't they? They just might come out the next day and there'll be some scandal. But I don't know. I would say I'd like to see some of the best restaurants in Sydney sending along their top chefs, perhaps in rotation as judges on this. And in terms of values, look, I absolutely agree with Kimberley. Food is about connection, it's about love, it is about burning off your stress at 3 a.m. because you really need to cook a pheasant right now. It's about so many things, and I think you can actually, instead of always having this tense atmosphere in these MasterChef programs where it's all about recreating the worst of a kitchen, it'd be fantastic to see the shows recreating what is best about cooking.
Okay, get some of the tension out of MasterChef. I'm not sure what that'll do the ratings, but Eric?
Look, on this one, I need a white flag to raise very, very quickly. Cooking has never been my forte. I was spoilt for 30 years by a lovely wife that always loved cooking for me, and I confess I've got nothing to add. But what I will add, if you're looking for somebody for your panel, I understand there's a Jessica Barrow in the audience that might be worthy of consideration.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll look for Jessica afterwards. Tim?
Well, I want to offer myself.
You've been there before.
I have.
He was actually a MasterChef judge.
I was a MasterChef judge.
You're a
I was
shrinking
never
violet,
invited
aren't you?
back. The Dalai Lama was on, and they kept saying, "What do you think?" And he'd giggle and say, "It's good." "What do you like?" He'd say, "The bread." They go, "The bread?" "Do you like this more than this dish?" He'd say, "No, just the same." And suddenly it hit me. I said, "Your Holiness, as a Buddhist, you're not allowed to judge, are you?" And he said, "No, we do not judge." And I saw Matt, Gary and what's his name?
George.
George.
Allowed to say that still.
Matt, Gary and George, faces fall. They were asking the Dalai Lama to do something he couldn't do. They quickly threw to me, and I said, "Look, I'm a Christian. I'm into judgment." This is what I like. So I think I'm qualified.
All right. Adam, a MasterChef without tension, a MasterChef without judging, and a set of judges that will represent love, generosity and connection. Who is it? Are we looking at him?
I can tell you that I have not received a phone call at all on this. But MasterChef Australia is the most influential cooking show in the entire world. And the reason that it is so popular and it connects with so many people is that it reflects the incredible food that we have here in Australia, the way that we cook in our own homes, the diversity of influences and the wonderful produce that we have. Unfortunately, one person who is not going to be on the judging panel, who I'd like to acknowledge, is Margaret Fulton, who very sadly passed away last week. She was a legend of Australian food. I'd like to honour her life and acknowledge that she is literally the woman that taught Australia how to cook. And my condolences go out to Suzanne, Kate, Louise and all of the Gibbs, Keats and Fulton families.
Hear, hear.
I think you can't stop there. I think you have to go to who would you see on the panel? Margaret would never have done it anyway. She said she doesn't like all that fancy stuff and that malarkey.
I'm not going to give you any names. I'm sorry. I'm sure that there's people that are in discussions on that at the moment. I can tell you absolutely that I'm not one of them.
You're not interested, or you're not one of them?
It's the best job in television and the best job in food. I don't think anyone in the country would not be interested in that job, but I haven't had a phone call yet.
OK, well, everybody, come on. I think we need to hear it for Get Behind Adam Liaw. Folau, we're starting it now. And just on that, just finally, though, the notion of MasterChef without some of the yelling, without some of the tension, what do you think?
Well, I mean, the proposition of the show is that it is a feel-good show. You know, it is about, there is tension, of course, into it. I prefer to cook with less tension than more. I think most people do in their own homes, but it is about celebrating food, and it's about celebrating not just the food that's on the plate, but also the people that make it and the stories that go behind it.
OK, that's it from us for tonight. You have been a fantastic audience, thank you. And can you please thank our panel, Parnell, McGuinness, Abetz, Tim Costello, Adam Liaw and Kimberley Kitching.